James K. Hoffmeier has been professor of Near Eastern Archaeology and Old Testament at Trinity International University and Divinity School since 1999. He was born and raised in Egypt, the son of missionaries. Dr. Hoffmeier graduated from Wheaton College with a BA in Near Eastern Studies and Archaeology. At the University of Toronto, he received his master's degree in Egyptian archaeology in 1975. He completed his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1982, concentrating on Egyptian religion. From 1980 to 1999, he was on the faculty of Wheaton College in Illinois. Since 1994, Dr. Hoffmeier has directed the North Sinai Archaeological project that was devoted to researching and studying Egypt's frontier during the New Kingdom, which included investigating Tel el-Bor from 1999 to 2008. Dr. Hoffmeier has authored a number of books, and several of them are on a table for display out in the back. As you leave, you can take a look at those, and if you're interested, you can find them online. Israel and Egypt, Evidence for the Authenticity of the Exodus Tradition, The Archaeology of the Bible, The Future of Biblical Archaeology, and some of his latest books are Akhenaten, His Religion and the Origins of Monotheism, and Genesis, History, Fiction, or Neither, 3 views on the Bible's earliest chapters. Dr. Hoffmeier was married in 1974. He and his wife Kathy have 2 children and a number of grandchildren. We are greatly excited and happy to have Dr. Hoffmeier with us this evening. Will you join me in giving him a warm Emmaus Bible College welcome?
Thank you very much. I almost didn't make it, but because yesterday was the 46th anniversary of our first date. So we did have a pizza of the sort we used to get in our early days from the very same place, Baroni's Pizza in Glen Ellen. So anyway, it's good to be here. I know some of you, I see at least one Cubs shirt. We want to get this thing done because the Cubs are, oh darn, it's less than an hour. Anyway, we'll try to at least get you there by the 3rd inning. Okay. All right, can we have some lights reduced so we can see pictures? That's really important, because you know the difference between an archaeologist and a historian? Historians don't show slides. That's the difference. Okay. And I would just urge you to students who are thinking along the lines that you were just encouraged to consider the archaeology minor and getting involved in a dig. I just want you to know that if you do, your career will lie in ruins. But that's a good thing. Okay. All right. Yeah, we're still a little. Can you just get rid of all these ones here? I will enlighten you if you put us in the dark. How's that? All right, so make sure you see the pictures. That was a little lame, but anyway. All right, we'll all look on this side. Okay. It's hard to believe that the most important event of Old Testament history, namely the Israelite exodus from Egypt, which I would say would be comparable to Easter for the Christian, the Exodus is the most important event of Old Testament history. And yet, from a standpoint of archaeology, we actually have no direct archaeological evidence for this very important event. One of the consequences of this has been in the last 20 to 30 years is there are growing voices in the academic world that want to completely reject the Exodus as a historical event. It may surprise you that some of those voices actually come from Israel. In fact, the guy's name is Israel. Israel Finkelstein, one of the most prominent Israeli archaeologists, in his book, The Bible Unearthed, and I quote where he says, "The historical saga contained in the Bible from Abraham's encounter with God and his journeys to Canaan to Moses' deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage is a brilliant product of human imagination. Brilliant product of human imagination. Rabbi David Wolpe, who is rabbi of one of the largest synagogues in North America, maybe the world, I don't know, in LA, rose in prominence and recognition some years ago when he said the following, and of all things, could you imagine a pastor strolling up to the pulpit on Easter Sunday and saying, there's no evidence the resurrection took place, so it probably didn't. That's in essence what he did to his congregation on Passover, saying, virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, I guess that's me, agrees that the way the Bible describes Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. Okay? A little closer to home, some of you may have crossed the encountered the name of Kenton Sparks. Kenton identifies himself as a progressive evangelical. Hope there are none of them here. But in any event, in his book, God's Words and Human Words, he says the silence of the Egyptian evidence on these matters, that is Passover and Exodus, is therefore an important argument against the historicity of these miracle reports. So he's prepared to, as a progressive evangelical, dismiss the historicity of the Exodus altogether. Now, I'll be the first to admit, as an archaeologist, that there is no direct archaeological evidence that the Hebrews were ever in Egypt, that there was a historical Moses. I have never found or heard of a discovery of an inscription that said Moses slept here. Nothing like that. So, what do we do as Bible-believing Christians? First of all, this statement I think is helpful. The absence of direct archaeological evidence, because of that, one is forced to look at what I would call contextual data provided by archaeology to see if what the Bible describes in the book of Exodus agrees or contradicts the secondary evidence. What I mean by that is we do know a lot about ancient Egypt. At the time, the general period when the Bible suggests to us the Hebrews were there and Moses led them out of Egypt. What do we have in the biblical narrative itself that can be corroborated, that would lend credibility or authenticity to what the Bible reports? Now, before anybody gets too nervous, I think probably everybody in this room would agree, we do not know for sure where Jesus was buried, and therefore from the point from which the resurrection occurred. There are a couple different traditions amongst archaeologists and historians and so on, whether it's this part of the Church of Holy Sepulchre or that, or the Garden Tomb, or all these different theories are out there. But the reality is, at the end of the day, we don't know for sure where the resurrection occurred, or where Calvary was. But yet, I suspect that we all believe that, or the vast majority of us do. And this would be a similar sort of thing. There are indications where things might have been, where things took place, but to find direct evidence contemporary with the events is almost impossible to discover. Now, while there is no evidence of the Hebrews in Egypt, there is ample evidence for Egypt in the Hebrew Bible. By that I mean, as one reads, and I'm trained as an Egyptologist who does biblical studies and teaches Old Testament, but I look at things through my Egyptological lens, and I see things that many people don't see because of my familiarity with the Egyptian material and backgrounds. One of the strongest indications that there was a population of Hebrews living in Egypt can be seen in the personal names of people associated with the Exodus or in the generations that followed. In other words, many of the names that you regularly encounter in the Bible are actually names of Egyptian origin, Egyptian etymology, as we would say, linguistically speaking. Now, many of the names that you see on this list are names you probably recognize, like Miriam and Phineas and Moses and Aaron, question mark. But all the names you see on this list are thought to be, or there are suggested Egyptian etymologies for these names, which makes sense. If you live somewhere in another country for multiple generations, you might start naming your kids using names that would be familiar to your neighbors and people that you're living with. Most interesting is the fact that there are on the right column here, Har-Nefer, Hur, remember Aaron's friend, Aaron and Hur, Hori, and we'll leave Pashhur out, but just take a note of that H-U-R there. All four of those names contain the name of the Egyptian god Horus, depicted here on the right. The Egyptian god Horus was probably the most prominent Egyptian deity in the northeastern delta of Egypt. The northeastern delta of Egypt. And the northeastern delta of Egypt is what the Bible calls the land of Goshen. So the most important deity in that area, somehow his name gets attached to the name of Hur, Hori, Har-Nefer, okay, Seth over there, Seth, I'm talking to you. What did we say Nefer meant before the lecture began? Beautiful. Beautiful. See, that guy's got a good memory. He's got a career lined up for him. Hor-Nefer means Horus is beautiful. Okay, Nefer like Nefertiti, okay? All right, so there you have these names. Look at the names with asterisks. Those names are all Levites from the tribe of Levi. Some of them are priests, and some of them are just Levites. Aaron, Moses, Miriam, Merari, Phineas. So clearly, you have a whole horde of people coming out of Egypt. Many of them had adopted Egyptian names. You don't do that if you didn't live in that country. Just like many of my Chinese students come live in the States during their years at school or early professional life, will take on American names. They want to fit in. They do that if they go to Egypt. Okay. So, I think this is a very strong argument, biblically, internally. How do you explain these names amongst the Hebrews leaving the Exodus if it was not the influence of their living in Egypt all those years? That's the sort of thing we can do. The other thing I want to do, there are two parts to what we're going to do tonight. One is to focus on the conditions the Bible describes that the Israelites had to endure, that we pick up in Exodus chapter 1. And that is the servitude, the hard labor, the bondage that the Egyptians imposed on the Hebrews. And Exodus 1, 11 and 14 talks about how the Egyptians enslaved the Hebrew population, set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. In the second part of what we do tonight, we're going to look at the geography, okay? So we'll come back to Ramesses a little bit later. And they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. So the Bible describes the Israelites as being pressed into hard labor for the state, and the two areas it identifies is making bricks for building projects and agriculture. Okay, is there any evidence that this sort of activity was going on where foreigners are pressed into hard labor for the Egyptian state? And the answer is yes. I take you to a tomb in southern Egypt, the tomb of an Egyptian prime minister named Hoffmeier, And this is the entrance to his tomb. That's not him, by the way, in case you're wondering. That's the guard, and he's there to make sure you don't take any pictures. So let me show you the pictures I got. Beautifully painted tomb. And I'll show you a scene that arrow is pointing to. And what you see are rows and rows of different craftsmen, artisans at work making things, carpentry, metalworking. In the middle, they're smelting copper. But the bottom one is the one I wanted to focus on here because this one shows brick making. Just take a look at it. You can see the whole process of brick making, from gathering water out of a pool, these large vessels, pouring it into clay, making mud, and here you can see the brick mold for making bricks, and so on. Here's the second part of the scene, and if you could get really close to this picture, or actually stand in the tomb and look at this, you would recognize that the people working are not Egyptians. Their skin color, the type of hair they have. In fact, we have two types of ethnicities presented here. One are people from Western Asia, that is what we'd say Syria, Canaan, and the other group are Nubians from modern-day Sudan. And who are these people and how did they get to Egypt? Now, just above this gentleman here, who was wearing a yoke carrying bricks, there he is, there's an inscription over his head, and the inscription tells us that these workers were prisoners of war, taken from the king's campaigns. And during the New Kingdom, that is the period from 1500 to 1200, Egyptian pharaohs marched south into what is today Sudan and controlled almost half of what is today Sudan, and marched north all the way to and across the Euphrates River. And every time they went on a military campaign, they bring back POWs. And these would be pressed into labor. Some would be put into the military. Some would be engaged in taking care of animals and so on. So here's a close-up, and by the way, a good look at these, you can clearly see the African features of these two workers making bricks. And here's an actual surviving brick mold, and below it a brick. Both of the brick and the brick mold are in the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada, Toronto. And so this gives us an exact depiction of the sort of thing the Bible is describing. Bricks being made by non-Egyptians. So, first on the checklist, yes, we do have clear evidence that foreigners were pressed into hard labor for the Egyptian state, making bricks for building projects. We also have textual evidence that foreigners were pressed into hard labor working in quarries as well, dragging stone. So the sort of things the Bible is describing fits very nicely with the secondary evidence. This is what I mean by secondary evidence. All right, the Bible tells us, Exodus 1, that bricks were being made to build the Arei Maskinot in Hebrew, which is traditionally translated something like store cities. I would rather translate them as storage facilities. In Hebrew thought, a city is a group of buildings that has a wall around it, a wall that encircles doesn't matter the size. You know, we're not talking about Chicago with a wall around it. Okay? We're talking about anything with even a small number of homes, as long as you have a wall around it, it's an Ir in Hebrew, a city. Case in point, when Cain, in Genesis 4, leaves the presence of God, he goes out and builds a city. How big would that have been for Cain, his wife, and his kids? We know he's building a wall because he was afraid people would come kill him, right? So he's building a protection. So it's a wall that's around it. What you're looking at here is an aerial view of the funerary temple of Ramses II, the great pharaoh of Egypt. Here you can see parts of the temple that still remain made of stone, but surrounding the temple complex are brick buildings and a wall that surrounds the entire complex. Here are the buildings, some of the buildings on the ground. You can still see, amazingly, after 3,200 years, some of the mud brick arch structures still intact. This area doesn't get much rain, southern part of Egypt. When you're up north, closer to the Mediterranean, you get rain. So something like this would not survive in the north. And where does the Bible place the Israelites? In the northeastern delta. And you don't get much in the way of survival of this sort of architecture. Okay? So here you have it, and these are storage facilities associated with the temple, and such storage facilities would be found in palaces. And just recently, I have a picture a little bit later on, I believe, where such facilities have been found in connection with large fortresses as well. So these are the sort of things that were being built by the Egyptians, storage facilities, and bricks, as you can see, was the choice material for such products. The Egyptian private tombs, the royal officials who worked for the pharaohs, often show us the sort of activities that were going on at their time, the things that they, in their official capacities, supervised. So, for instance, a brick-making scene would have been something that was done under the authority of the vizier, the prime minister. What you see here are 2 rows of foreigners being brought into Egypt. These are POWs. And you can see there are a couple Egyptian officials here with sticks prodding these people on. Look at the people down here. Very interesting clothes. They're very, very different clothes than the people up here. And again, this is their way of showing different ethnicities by hairstyle, by clothes, and so on. So here's a nice illustration of the foreigners being brought into Egypt from the campaigns of the pharaoh. Another scene that's prominent, I'm going to skip through this one because the color one is a little bit better, different tomb. But what you see going on here is work in a grape arbor, and what you have going on is picking grapes. Down below here you have a grape press in which the grapes are being trod on, and the large amphorae, these large vessels, are being filled with the grape juice that will become wine in due course. Now I'm going to move in a little closer, and once again, because this tomb is nicely painted, you can clearly see this guy's black African. Look at these guys with blonde hair. Egyptians don't have blonde hair. These are probably Syrians, or from what we would call Syria today on the map. And here is clearly this gentleman here with this little sprouting beard and the receding hairline is probably a Canaanite. So what you're seeing here in the agricultural realm is the same thing. You basically have foreigners working on these large estates. They could be owned by the pharaoh, they could belong to a temple, but they would be under the supervision of the official whose tomb we're looking at right now. In fact, there's the Egyptian official. You see, he's dressed in proper white linens, he's got nice black hair, he's an Egyptian. But these people are not Egyptians. So, what does this all prove? It proves that what the Bible is describing in Exodus 1 through 5 especially fits very nicely with what we know about what was going on in Egypt during the general period where we placed the Israelites in Egypt. So it's a nice correlation. Doesn't prove it, but it shows that this is not a far-fetched suggestion. A number of Jewish scholars have pointed out, and it makes a lot of sense, that if the Israelites didn't originate in Egypt, they surely would have come up with a much better story. If they were trying to make up a story about their origin, why come up with a story about being slaves? What a humbling story about your origin. If they're making something up, you think you'd come up with something better than that. All right. Second area I want to move into is the area of the geography as described in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Numbers. And this is a very significant thing because there's been an ongoing debate over the years as to whether the geography, that is the places named in the book of Exodus, And the place is named in connection with the travels of the Israelites, the so-called route of the Exodus. Are these authentic, or are they just made up at a certain time in history and reflect the time in history of the story? Here are the names of some of the scholars who, as recently as the 1980s and 1990s, have suggested that the geography described in the Bible is really a mythological, unreliable reference. One commentator on the book of Exodus, William Johnstone, 1995, once says we should only be looking at Exodus for theology, not for questions of history and geography. So he says, it is again futile, therefore, to attempt to locate this theological affirmation in geographical detail. And so I did not take his advice, and I tried to look at the geographical details. It's quite one thing to say, we don't know about the geographical details, we cannot verify it, but it's quite another thing to say, we shouldn't even bother looking. Another view held by Israel Finkelstein, whose book I cited from earlier, he follows the view of Redford, Donald Redford, very distinguished professor, happened to be my professor, with whom I disagree vehemently, but still love him. Both he and Van Cedars are, I don't know about your theology, backslidden evangelicals of an earlier day, but anyway, all of them are suggesting that the geography really fits a much later period. These are made-up stories, and the biblical writers in the 6th century are just trying to make the story fit the geography of the day, not of a more ancient time. All right. Well, those are the kinds of issues I've been dealing with in the last 20 or so years. Let's go back to Exodus 1 and verse 11. I don't have time to look into Pithom, but trust me, we have a number of references from the 13th century BC of a place called Pithom, and I'll show you on a map a little bit later on, so there's no doubt that there was a place called Pithom, and we know what it means. Pithom means the house of the god Atum. Atum is the sun god whose worship center was at Heliopolis, or today a suburb of Cairo. And why that's significant biblically, of course, is that the high priest of Heliopolis married off his daughter to a guy named Joseph. Right? Yeah, Potiphar, the priest of Heliopolis, or On, as the Hebrew says. So that's the god Atum. All right. Ramses is far more interesting because we have a number of references to Ramses in the Bible. First of all, it's a place where Pharaoh allows Joseph's family to settle when they come to Egypt, Genesis 47:11. In Exodus 1:11, we've already seen it as the places where the Israelites were making bricks for the storage facilities. Exodus 12:37, it's the launching off point for the Exodus. That's the departure point. That's where they rallied to leave Egypt. And then Numbers chapter 33, 3 and 5 also mention Ramses as the place from which the Exodus began. So both Exodus and Numbers agree that Ramses is the starting point. What's so intriguing here is that once you leave the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the word Ramses never occurs again in the Bible. Is that just an accident? Well, first of all, we want to say, do we know anything about a city in the northeastern delta that would correspond to what the Bible's talking about in the land of Goshen? And the answer is yes. Indeed, there was a delta capital or royal residence, and it was called Ramesses, the House of Ramses, and it was built by Ramses II. And here's what's significant. It flourished between about 1270 BC, and by 1130 BC, the city was abandoned. That's why we never hear about it again after you leave the books of Moses. didn't exist. We'll tell you what happened to it. About 100 years after it was abandoned, or 75 years after it was abandoned, and by the way, the reason it was abandoned, and this is, you'll see again in what I present here, the way geology and archaeology work together. Archaeology is just not digging holes in the ground, it's also looking at the ground in which you are digging. And geology helps us there considerably. So, what we now know is that there was a very important Nile branch that flowed by the city of Ramses, that in the course of the history of that site began to dry out. And in about 150 years, the river was basically a stream and you couldn't navigate, you couldn't bring ships along it. And so the major city of Egypt was completely cut off from access to the rest of Egypt, because that's how you travel in Egypt. You go from way south Egypt all the way to the Mediterranean by sea, by water, by Nile. With that branch of the Nile being dried out, the city was abandoned. About 75, 80 years later, a new city was built up in large part out of the remains of Ramses, and this was a city called Zoan, depending on your Bible translation. Zoan is Hebrew, Zoan, and if you have an NIV or another more modern Bible, you read Tanis. Tanis is simply the Greek vocalization of the Hebrew Zoan. And yes, Tanis is where Indiana Jones found the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, if you're with me there, that's the right place. At least it's a real place. Okay. Now, here's what's interesting, is that Tanis is also mentioned in the Bible, in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, and of all places in Psalm 78. Now, why do I say that? Because Psalm 78 is recalling the miracles and the wonders that God brought about in Egypt that led to the Exodus. And he doesn't refer to this as happening in the fields of Ramses, but the fields of Zoan. Well, why does he not mention Ramses? Well, clearly when the psalmist is writing, 500 or more years later, 600 years later, Ramses didn't exist. 12 miles to the north, Tanis was the city that replaced it. And the blocks, many of the blocks of Tanis originated in Ramses. So the Egyptians were the original recyclers. Okay, all these dots on this map are different proposed locations for Ramses. If you go back and look at old, as early as recently as 1970, you'll still find atlases identifying Ramses with Tanis. Back a little after 1900, Tel Oratabo was thought to be Ramses. Pelusium way out here on the edge of Sinai, Egypt. All these places were thought to be Ramses. Now we know, and the French have excavated the site of Tanis for over 80 years. But 12 miles south of Tanis is a village called Kantir, and it's in the fields of Kantir where the actual city of Ramses existed. German archaeologists have been working there off and on over the past 30 years. There's a block from that excavation, and perhaps the most interesting discovery made in the early 2000s was the remains of a very large stable. What you're looking at are the hitching posts that were found in the ground where the horses would be tied up in the stable. And it was estimated, based on the sheer size of this stable, that it could house 500 horses. So the idea of Pharaoh sending 600 chariots in pursuit of the Israelites is not a far-fetched thing when 500 chariots alone, or 500 horses, 2 to a chariot, could have come from that stable by itself. So that's cool. Here we are in the fields of Ramses, or the fields of Zoan, as Psalm 78 suggests. And you see two of my friends here and here. This is David Schweik. I employed these same experts in ground-penetrating magnetometry, and they're from the University of Warsaw in Poland. They're some of the best in the world at it. But what they're able to do is to actually, by working systematically through fields, this is a really large area that's been done over many, many years, but you zoom in a little closer and you can actually see the outlines of walls and buildings. And that, of course, makes our task a lot easier because we know if you want to dig a palace, that'd be a good place. This is the palace. You can just tell by the architectural plan, the way it's laid out, what it is. If it's a temple, it would look different. If it's tombs, it would look different. And a great aid now for us working in archaeology in the Middle East is to use this technology. Anyway, to give you a sense, the city of Ramses, today, other than a few blocks sitting in the field, as I said, many of the blocks were removed and reused, but this city occupied about 10 square kilometers. As best we can tell, it was the largest city of the ancient world. And today, as you can see from this picture, it's fields with small mud brick villages. So what was a huge city is completely gone. And that's just to give you an indication of the challenge of doing archaeological work. Things don't always survive, especially mud brick structures in a moist environment where the Nile floods every year during the months of August, September, October. Now all that's controlled by dams. It wasn't in ancient times. Okay, so we can establish where Ramses was, at least the place the Bible is referring to, is in the northeastern delta. And that is the starting point of the Exodus. And Exodus 13:17 says something rather interesting. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the land of the Philistines, although it was near, for God said, lest they turn back. I want you to remember that word, it's shuv in Hebrew, turn back. Lest they turn back when they see war and return to Egypt. What was out there on this road that the Israelites would encounter, they would panic and turn back? We didn't know for sure until about 30 years ago, and over the last 15 it's become clear. Okay, so here's where we are, this area right here, and the Bible's telling us, and sorry, this is an older map, but you get the idea. Here is the road that the Bible calls the way of the land of the Philistines, because if you followed this road, you'd go to where the Philistines' territory was, just in the southern part of Canaan, next to Israel. So this is the one road out of Egypt, and then there's a second road out of Egypt, and we know it from the Bible also. It's called the Way of Shur, S-H-U-R in your English Bibles. That road actually figures quite prominently in the patriarchal narratives, because when Abraham is living in Beersheba up here, and he travels to Egypt or back, or Hagar wants to go to Egypt, it's on this road, the Way of Shur. That's the name of the road, because Shur is the name of the area of the wilderness right as you enter Egypt over here. So it's called the Way of Shur. So these are the two roads. If you want to leave Egypt and go east, you have two choices. You either go that road, or God's going to have to make a way some other way. But those are the two roads. Those are the two options. I take you to Karnak Temple. Maybe some of you have been to Egypt. If you get to Egypt, you will want to go to Karnak Temple. If you haven't, it's a must-see, huge temple. But on the outside wall, back away from the entrance, is this magnificent scene showing the Pharaoh, Seti I. A little hard to see, so let me show you a line drawing of this. This is Seti I. He is the father of Ramses II, who built the great city. And actually it was his father who started building the city. But here he is, he's returning from a military campaign. He's been in southern Canaan, fighting these troublesome people called the Shasu in Egyptian texts. And by the way, he's bringing some of them back as prisoners. Okay? And these Shasu are Bedouin, they're desert dwellers who lived in southern Canaan and in Sinai. Maybe they are one of the same as the Amalekites of the Bible. But the Egyptians called them Shasu, which is like our word Bedouin, desert dwellers. Doesn't identify a specific ethnicity to them. Okay? Now, what's significant about this scene and what's unique about it is that we have depictions of and the names of forts that go from Egypt's frontier all the way across, and there are 10 forts in a sequence on this road, and it ends up in the land of Canaan. Okay? And what you're seeing on the right side of this are two buildings, two fortification structures on either side of a body of water. And the name is there. It's called the Fortress Sharu. And this was Egypt's frontier town. There's a big fort according to the texts. And this was a place where if you were coming to Egypt, you would have to present your passports. This is where you get your visas stamped. And I'm not kidding, because the Egyptian word that's used here, khetem, means seal. You get your documents sealed, permission to come into the country. Okay? Okay, for you older folks, it's Checkpoint Charlie. Young people don't know what Checkpoint Charlie is, right? It's Checkpoint Charlie. Okay. Now, so we have bodies of water, and then we have more forts, and don't let the size throw you off. The important thing here, from the Pharaoh's point of view, is him and his horses, and the forts are sort of background. But here you see the forts. And so take note of this. We have two forts either side of a body of water. Another fort here, it's called the Dwelling of the Lion. And the third fort in this sequence, and this is the one I want you to remember, is called the Migdal of Seti I. In other words, named after the pharaoh. And that was the practice. The reigning king's name would be attached to the fort or the city. Okay? All right. This is a satellite image, declassified CIA stuff from the 1960s. You can buy it from the US Geological Survey. But what we have here is a marvelous picture from about 1967 that shows the area of where I conducted my work for many years, for about 10 years. And what we're dealing with here is the ancient coastline. This was the ancient Mediterranean coastline. All that you see here was ocean, going back 3,000-4,000 years ago. The black line you see here is moisture from the Suez Canal that divides Egypt from Sinai. Okay? And there was this ancient body of water called a Paleo Lagoon, but right here on the coast was an archaeological site that was discovered in the early 1980s by my Egyptian colleague, Dr. Mohammed Abdul Maqsood. And this huge fort, you can get a sense for the walls here. There's a man standing here. But the walls are about 12 feet across, and then when the turrets go out, it adds another 3 feet to them. And this fort is about 400 yards long and about 600 yards 600 long and about 400 wide. Huge fort. Here's this architectural drawing of the fort. And it goes through several different phases all the way back to about the 17th century BC. And this is Dr. Abdul Maqsood. And in May 1999, the day I went to visit him in his office, this statue was found. And why it's so significant is that, it's the god Horus. Remember they were talking about earlier? Oh, about that. Interesting. The deity being honored here is Horus, the lord of Sharu. That's the name of our fort. And it was found within the fort. It's very rare for an archaeologist to find the name of the site you're digging in excavations at the site. So this is huge when you find something with the name on it at the site. Because it's not like you drive up to a site and there's an ancient sign saying, "Welcome to," and the name of your site. Okay? In 2005, a group of statues were found again in the temple area, and this statue also had an inscription and identified the place as Sharu. So this is huge to actually nail down the name of the place. And so what that means is we know now for sure where this fort is located. It's the one right here. And there are two forts, one on either side of this body of water. And on the other side, and by the way, today it's all desert, but one of the first things I did back in 1995 was between these two sites, I was augering down into the sand at 50-yard intervals to understand the subsurface, the sand, what was below it, and it's mud. because there's a branch of the Nile that flowed through there 3,001 years ago. This is the fort on the other side of the body of water, and it's even larger. Look at the man there. These walls are about 30 feet thick. This is a huge fort. And here's an aerial shot. This is the temple area within the fort. And by the way, here are these long rectangular buildings, the storage facilities that I showed you earlier. Nothing is preserved except the foundations here, because we get rain in northern Egypt. Okay? So what we now have then are the two forts depicted on that scene with the body of water going through it. And it would have emptied into this lagoon. Now, I want to take you to the site I am responsible for directing excavations, and it's right here, the site called Tel El Borg. And by the way, what this map is showing you is where other known archaeological sites are located. This one has been excavated now by French archaeologists. And the point is, because the body of water located here in ancient times in the Mediterranean out here, we get a better idea of what the Israelites would have had to face. Because the forts connect to form the road. And this is the road that we're told God didn't lead them that way. Why? Because they would see war and turn back. They would come out of Egypt, and they would have had the Nile flowing on one side, the Mediterranean would be out here, you'd have forts, and you could see why they would say, let's go back. You know, maybe it wasn't so bad making bricks. Okay? So you get a sense for what the Bible is hinting at in Exodus 13:17. All right. So this is the road they didn't travel. So which way did they go? Again, following the biblical text, the people set out and journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. Numbers tells us the same thing. So we have three different references, all agreeing that they start at Ramesses, and the first place they encamped is a place called Succoth. Now, remember, the other road out of Egypt goes out this way. So it seems they're heading that way to get out of Egypt. Right here in this little green strip that you see come out of the delta, almost like a thumb sticking out, is an area today that's known in Arabic as Wadi, which means valley, Wadi, or a place where a seasonal stream will go through, Wadi Tumilat. Wadi Tumilat. Why is that significant? The significance is that Tum preserves the ancient name of the god Atum, the sun god. Okay, so that preserves the ancient name. There's an archaeological site that's now being excavated. It's been excavated way back at the turn of the 20th century, or turn of the 19th century. It was dug again in the 1970s and 80s by one of my professors, the late Jack Holliday, and now Italians are working there once again. But the name, and this is the Arabic name, is Tel El Maskuta. And maybe you can see there in the Arabic name Sukkot. And this is quite common in the Middle East, where ancient names survive into the modern Arabic name. And so we're talking about a name that survived all the way back from Pharaonic days to the current name of the site. So it's pretty clear, because of this location, the Israelites were heading this way, trying to get on this other road out of Egypt. And by the way, discovered here was a block. It's now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And here's our Pharaoh Ramses smiting a foreigner. And he is doing so as a living sacrifice, at least that guy was living, for the deity standing there. And the deity is called Atum, Lord of Sukkot. So again, we have an actual ancient text, and the modern name of the site both agree. And Atum is the deity, the sun god, and so the name Wadi Tumilat also preserves the ancient name. So this is all coming together. So they're heading for that southern road to get out of Egypt. And it says then in Exodus 13:20, they moved from Succoth and encamped at Etam. Have no clue where that is. But it's described as being on the edge of the wilderness. They're just about out of Egypt. They're right on the border. I mean, this is it. We're home free. All right? What happens next is absolutely weird. It makes no sense, but it makes for a great sermon. And by that I mean, God says, shuv, turn back. You want us to turn back and head right back into trouble? Here we are on the edge of the wilderness, ready to go. And I think it becomes clear when you read on in this chapter, God's saying, look, this is too easy. I have one more test, one more encounter with Pharaoh that you're going to experience. So tell the Israelites to shuv, turn back, and camp in front of Pi-Hahirot. I don't have time to get into that. I've written about it. Between Migdol and the sea that they're going to pass through, in front of a place called Baal Zephon, and you shall camp opposite it. Now, what I'm keen for us to see here is the name of Migdol. Because Exodus 14:2 has the Israelites camping in the shadow of a place called Migdol, and we know from that scene of Seti I that there's a fort on Egypt's border called Migdol. Now that's a correlation. You just can't say, that's a coincidence. Because the name Migdol is very rare. Those of you who studied Hebrew will know Migdol is not even an Egyptian word. It's a Semitic word. It means fort or tower. A lookout tower, a fort. But it's the name of a fort here on Egypt's frontier. So in other words, after being at the very edge of the border, ready to leave, God says turn, and apparently directs them right up to the area they were originally trying to avoid. This is what I mean, it makes for a good sermon, because it reminds us that God does not always lead us on the path that's easiest. When the Israelites are leaving Kadesh Barnea, after their 40 years in the wilderness, God could have led them straight up into the land of Canaan. What does he do? He sends them around by the Transjordan and has them cross the Jordan River. Again, it doesn't make any sense. But it's very clear from the book of Joshua that God says, all right, your father's generation crossed the sea. I want this generation to cross the river. And again, having to trust God to get you through that difficult situation. All right, so here we are back up in the area where we were doing our investigation. I'm going to take you to visit our site here very quickly to show you some of the things that we found. But it's a key site along the road of the Exodus. We actually found two forts, the remains of two forts, very poorly preserved, but the best part preserved was a moat. This is a moat with mud brick, top fired brick on the bottom, which is very rare in this period, going back 3,500 years ago. As I said, we found two forts. One dates to the period of the early Exodus, if you like that. The other fort dates to the late period Exodus. So I keep everybody happy with my discoveries. Okay, and on the top would have been a wall going up about 30 feet, and that wall's completely deteriorated. Nothing's left. What we have is the moat. Here's another section of the moat. It's very steep, about 45-degree angle. Here are some of our Egyptian Bedouin workers. These are desert folk, as we call them. And this guy's hanging on a rope, rappelling to clean it off to get our official pictures taken. He saw me taking my picture. He turned to me and says, "Ya Mudir, oh director, why did they make these walls so steep? We can't climb up." And I said, "That's the idea." Anyway, so imagine trying to get in there, and then where those other guys are standing, you have a wall about 30 feet up into the air. So this was to guard Egypt's frontier from invasion. Now, I'll tell you about a cool discovery. This was, you see all the sand. This is a kind of faded, very bright part of the day, unfortunately, but here's the wall on the outside of the moat. And this is the wall like here, before we cleared the next section over. Here's the wall here, here's the wall here. And with all this sand, and you know, you can dig for days and find nothing in this sand. It's just all blown in. So we had this great big football player guy, Dwayne from Tennessee. And where are you going to put a guy like Dwayne? You don't want to put him somewhere delicate or he's going to ruin something. So go dig sand, Dwayne. Okay? So he sent Dwayne in his wheelbarrow over to the sand where he could do no harm. He starts digging right there. Now I wasn't there, but this is the report I got. First shovel into the sand, frozen in his wheelbarrow, here's a clunk. He had gold! And Very cool, a lot of pieces of gold. A beautiful bowl that had been cut up was going to be melted down, apparently. And perhaps the neatest thing were earrings. Very fashionable, ladies. These are the kind of earrings that would have been worn in the New Kingdom, the general period of the Exodus. And so when you read about the women taking their earrings and giving them to Aaron to make the golden calf, that's what they would have looked like. All right. Well, here's an outline of the two forts we found. The red one is the red brick one, 130 yards long, about 75 wide. Then we had the remains of a second fort in the brown walls. Unfortunately, a canal was dug through here in the 1990s that destroyed a large section of this. This will give you an idea of the challenge the archaeologist faces in this environment. This is all that's left of a wall that was probably once 30 feet high. We might have one or two bricks left. So this is actually below the street level of the day. That's how much erosion or deflation has occurred. There's the wall going up to the gate area. And this one also had a moat. And in the foundation, we found some inscribed blocks, which is very interesting. And we also found, because the moat was never completed, it was used as a garbage dump. And my benefactor, that's another story, maybe I'll tell you sometime, we found the remains of 4 horses thrown in here. And I told him, I said, they drowned. Okay, we don't. Anyway. One of the cool things we found in the foundation of the moat is this stela, or stone inscription. Here's a drawing, maybe you can see it better. Yeah, that's pretty good. But here we have 2 Syro-Canaanite deities, Resheph and Astarte, both of whom had made their way into Egypt during this period. And the most interesting thing is that the man adoring these gods here is the overseer of the stables. He's the stable master. So we know from this inscription that we had stables for horses and chariots at our fort. And the other interesting thing, he's not an Egyptian. He is the name of a Syrian name, or a Hurrian name. His name was Betu. And the significance there is, you remember the story about how Pharaoh said to Joseph's brothers, hey, any of you know how to take care of cattle, know how to take care of animals? Yeah, I can put you to work. And it's the same thing. Here's a foreigner who probably knew a lot about horses. And here he is, dressed like an Egyptian, wearing an Egyptian hairdo, still has his foreign name, worshiping his foreign gods. But he has a job minding the horses in the stables. That's a very cool discovery. All right, back to our scene here now. So we've seen the 2 forts, okay, the ones we talked about here. This site, Tel el-Borg, I believe, is the dwelling of the lion, the second fort in sequence. The question is, where is Migdol? Because Migdol should be a key point for determining where the body of water is the Israelites would have passed through. If indeed Migdol is, of this inscription and text, is Migdol of Exodus 14:2. Okay, so here's our site, and we've already shown how the road lines up sites and then goes off to the land of Canaan. Now look at the very southern end of this ancient impression of what was a large lake. By the way, to give you a sense of scale, from the opening to the bottom tip is about 5 miles. So it's about 5 miles by 5 miles. So a large body of water. The very southern tip, there's this dark dot, and the circle around it, an Israeli archaeologist surveying there in the 1960s and 70s found pottery and other remains that showed that this site was a New Kingdom site. Again, that's the general period of the Exodus. Early or late, take your pick. But he never excavated there. I just got an email from him recently, because I had done more work on this. And he says, well, there were so many landmines, we didn't want to get too close to it. And landmines were a real issue there. One day, my colleague, Dr. Tom Davis, who's at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, was doing some of the survey work for us. And he was holding the stick, for surveying, that stick, dragging his rod in the wilderness or whatever. And he's standing there holding his stick merrily while his colleague is shooting in points. And he looks, and he's standing on a landmine. and we had a prayer meeting. No, I wasn't there, but he prayed and dove. Unfortunately, it didn't go off. But I can understand the fear of Professor Orr and his team not to go too close to this area. But if we enlarge it, we can see there's a rectangular structure here. And then recently I came across a 1957 image of this taken by the Egyptian Air Force. And you could actually see the outline of a moat around it. So this is a very large fort. You get a sense of scale, 240 meters by 170 meters. So I believe this is the fortress Migdol. Can't prove it, we can't dig it, because today it's covered by a fruit orchard. It turned into a fruit farm. We walked all over the place, and it's covered with trees and sand and so on. Now, if this is right, and here we take all our archaeological data, all our geological data, superimpose it on a Google Earth image, and you can see the road, the forts as they line up, the branch of the Nile that came into this lake. We discovered a branch of the Nile flowing through our site that was responsible for the northern end of this wetland or lake. And here is the site of Migdol. Now, if I'm right, we have two choices of bodies of water. That could well be the Yam Suf or the Sea of Reeds that the Bible is talking about. Now, let's just review quickly the geography and bring us all to an end. Every one of these places that we've talked about in passing, we know from Egyptian texts, we know archaeologically, and the names have survived. Migdol we've mentioned, Sukkot we've mentioned, and even Yam Suf, the Hebrew word for the Sea of Reeds that we have in the book of Exodus and elsewhere, is linguistically connected to the Egyptian word for reeds, which we have again in Egyptian documents going back to the New Kingdom period. So, in terms of the argument that the geography is just made up, doesn't wash. It all seems to fit, and it seems to have both archaeological and linguistic connections to New Kingdom Egypt. Okay. Skip over that. I'm going to skip over this. Okay, this is okay. Here's where we want to take us to wrap up. When the plague of the locusts is causing havoc in Egypt, we're told that God removed the locusts by changing the wind into a west wind, very strong. This is the New Jerusalem Bible translation. A west wind very strong, which carried the locusts away and swept them into the Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds. I chose that translation because it actually translates the Hebrew properly. It doesn't translate as Red Sea, but Reed Sea. Swept them into the Sea of Reeds. This is Dr. Stephen Mosier, geologist from Wheaton College, who was my collaborator and the geologist who worked with us, along with Egyptian geologists from the Geological Survey. Here's an area that still remains part of that ancient marshland. Most of it is desert today, but you can see how a little water turns this area into why the ancients called it the Sea of Reeds. Huge reeds going everywhere. Most of this area, as I say, is turned to desert, but we did drilling. We went down to a depth of 12, 15 feet or more, and we were able to pretty much determine where this ancient lake was. We found the coastline up here, and I know some people get bothered. They say, well, this looks like too small a body of water for the Exodus, the drowning of the army and all that. If you go from the edge of this out 320 meters, and my son actually helped with the surveying on this, the drop-off is 6 meters or about 18, 19 feet. So you're talking about something that could have been in ancient times 20 feet deep or more. So we're not talking about a little puddle, we're talking about a significant body of water on Egypt's eastern frontier. Here is that body of water, and this is a map prepared by the Australian archaeologist, Manfred Bitak, who has worked for over 40 years in this area. So here's the land of Ramses. Think of the locusts devouring the land of Ramses and the Egyptians living around this major city, and the wind blows them east into Yam Suf. There. It works. So anyway, that's my body of water I call the sea. You can choose another one if you like, but that's my working hypothesis, that we have, especially when we see the reference to Migdol, that fort on the frontier of Egypt, we have the body of water named in Egyptian text. And to give you some sense of size, this lake is even much larger. We're talking about something that's maybe 20 miles long. So we're dealing with a substantial body of water. In any event, I think what we can say is that the secondary evidence that comes from archaeological data, ancient texts, now geology, seems to fit very well in describing what the Bible is talking about. And so I think after, well, I remember as a kid, 14 years old, visiting Tanis and looking around and saying, where did these stories in the Bible take place? I started asking those questions over 50 years ago, and now I say with a fair amount of confidence that I'm pretty sure we can say, this really happened. And I think we can agree with Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, when talking about the Exodus and passing through the sea, where he said, these things happened. We don't need this to prove it, but it sure helps. And it certainly helps me, but I think this work and whatever work might be done in the future, I believe will only further corroborate the authenticity of what the Bible is describing and the truthfulness of the message. Thank you very much.